The gunshot that killed her husband echoed through Deborah Gardner's mind every single day, not because she had fired it, but because the whole town of Steins Pass, New Mexico, believed she had driven him to his death in 1881. Deborah stood at the counter of Miller's General Store, her gloved hands trembling slightly as she placed 3 coins on the worn wood. The shopkeeper, Mrs. Miller, swept them up without meeting her eyes, as though even looking at Deborah might contaminate her soul. The other customers in the store had gone silent the moment Deborah entered, their conversations dying like flowers in a frost. She gathered her small parcel of flour and coffee, tucking it into her basket with as much dignity as she could muster. "Thank you," Deborah said quietly, "but Mrs. Miller had already turned away. The walk back to her small house on the edge of town felt longer every time. Deborah kept her eyes forward, her dark hair pinned severely beneath her bonnet, her black mourning dress still worn 2 years after Thomas Gardner's death. She had loved her husband once, truly loved him, but that love had curdled into something desperate and afraid during those final months when his gambling debts mounted, and his temper grew shorter with each passing day. The whispers had started immediately after Thomas rode out that morning and never came back. They found him 3 miles outside town with a bullet in his chest and an empty whiskey bottle beside him. The sheriff ruled it suicide, but the town had other ideas. A man did not kill himself without reason, they said, and what reason could Thomas Gardner have had except a shrewish wife who had spent all his money and driven him to despair? None of it was true. Deborah had begged Thomas to stop gambling, had scraped together what little money she could from sewing and mending to pay their debts, had endured his rage when he came home drunk and empty-handed. She had been 23 years old when he died, a bride of only 3 years, and now at 25, she was an outcast in the only town she had ever known. Her small house sat at the end of a dusty road, its paint peeling and its garden struggling against the harsh New Mexico sun. Deborah let herself inside and set the basket on the table, then sank into a chair and allowed herself one moment of weakness, pressing her palms against her eyes. She would not cry. She had learned that tears changed nothing. A knock at the door startled her upright. Visitors were rare, and most of them came only to deliver more judgment or demand payment for old debts that Thomas had left behind. Deborah smoothed her skirt and opened the door, expecting another creditor. Instead, she found herself looking up at a tall man with sun-weathered skin and dark hair that curled slightly at his collar. He held his hat in his hands, and his blue eyes were kind in a way that made Deborah's throat tighten with unexpected emotion. "Mrs. Gardner?" he asked, his voice deep and measured. "Yes," she replied cautiously. "My name is Matthew Donnelly. I am looking to hire someone who can sew and mend. I run a small ranch about 5 miles west of here, and I have 3 ranch hands who are constantly tearing their clothes, and not a one of them knows how to thread a needle. Mrs. Henderson at the boarding house said you do fine work." Deborah stared at him, searching for the trick, the cruelty that must be hiding beneath this offer. Mrs. Henderson had been one of the few people in town who still spoke to her, though even she kept their interactions brief and private. "I do so," Deborah said slowly. "But surely there are other women in town who could help you." "I asked you," Matthew said simply. "Mrs. Henderson showed me a shirt you had mended for one of her boarders. The stitching was near invisible. That is the kind of work I need. And you know who I am, what people say about me." Matthew met her eyes steadily. "I know your name is Deborah Gardner and you are a widow. The rest is none of my concern unless it affects the quality of your sewing, which I doubt it does." Something in Deborah's chest loosened, just a fraction. What would the work entail? "I would bring the mending to you once a week. You would have it ready by the next week, and I would pay you fair wages. If that suits you, we could start immediately. I have a bag of clothes in my wagon right now that are desperate for attention." Deborah hesitated. Accepting work from this stranger would give the town more to gossip about, but she needed the money desperately. Her savings from Thomas's life were nearly gone, and the few sewing jobs that came her way were barely enough to keep her fed. "That would be acceptable," she said finally. Matthew's face broke into a smile that transformed his entire countenance. "I will get the bag." He returned a moment later with a canvas sack that bulged with fabric. "I will be honest, Mrs. Gardner, some of these are in rough shape. My men are hard on their clothes." Deborah took the bag and peeked inside. Torn seams, missing buttons, a few items that looked like they had lost arguments with barbed wire. "I can manage this. When do you need them?" "Next Friday, if that gives you enough time." "That will be fine." Matthew nodded and placed several coins on the porch railing. "Half now, half when the work is done. I appreciate this, Mrs. Gardner." "Thank you, Mr. Donnelly." He settled his hat back on his head and tipped it to her before walking back to his wagon. Deborah watched him go, still half convinced this was some elaborate joke. But the coins were real, and so was the bag of mending. She carried both inside and spread the damaged clothes across her table, already planning which items to tackle first. For the first time in months, Deborah felt something other than despair. It was small, fragile as a bird's egg, but it was hope. The week passed in a blur of needle and thread. Deborah worked by lamplight long into the evenings, her fingers flying through repairs and reinforcements. She found herself taking extra care with each piece, wanting the work to be perfect. Matthew Donnelly had offered her something precious, respect and employment, and she would not disappoint him. When Friday arrived, Deborah had every item cleaned, mended, and folded neatly in the bag. She dressed in her least worn black dress and waited, trying not to watch the road too obviously. Matthew arrived precisely at noon, his wagon rattling up to her gate. "Mrs. Gardner," he greeted her, swinging down from the seat with easy grace. "Mr. Donnelly, your mending is ready." She brought out the bag and watched as he opened it, examining the top few items. His eyebrows rose. "This is exceptional work. You even reinforced the stress points. They will last longer that way. I can see that." He handed her the remaining payment, and Deborah noticed he had added an extra coin. "That is for the extra care you took. My men will be pleased to have clothes that might actually survive a full day's work." "Thank you." Matthew cleared his throat. "I will have more next week if you are willing. And Mrs. Gardner, I was wondering if you might consider coming out to the ranch. My men would like to meet you, and I think it would be easier for you to fit them properly for some new shirts I want to order. They have been making do with ill-fitting hand-me-downs for too long." Deborah froze. Going to his ranch would mean spending time in proximity to Matthew and his men, facing possible judgment from strangers. But it would also mean more work and more money. "When would you need me to come?" "Tomorrow afternoon, if you are available. I could bring the wagon to town and drive you out. You would be home before dark." The offer was tempting. More than that, Matthew's steady gaze held no pity, no censure, just honest respect. Deborah found herself nodding. "Tomorrow afternoon would be acceptable. I will collect you at 2 o'clock then." After he left, Deborah sat with the coins in her palm, feeling their weight. This was how her life could change, she realized. Not through grand gestures or the town's sudden forgiveness, but through small acts of decency from people who chose to see her as more than her past. The next afternoon, Deborah dressed in a simple gray dress, a tentative step away from her mourning black. She pinned her hair carefully and was waiting on her porch when Matthew's wagon appeared. He helped her up onto the seat, his hand strong and steady beneath her elbow. "It is a pleasant day for a drive," Matthew said as they started out of town. "Not too hot yet." "Yes," Deborah agreed, hyper-aware of the curtains twitching in windows as they passed. Let them look, she thought with a spark of defiance. She was conducting honest business, nothing more. As they left Stein's Pass behind, Deborah felt some of the tension ease from her shoulders. The landscape stretched out around them, vast and open under the endless blue sky. Mountains rose in the distance, their peaks still holding snow despite the warming spring weather. "How long have you had your ranch?" Deborah asked. "5 years now. I came out from Kansas after the war looking for a fresh start, bought the land cheap from a man who could not make a go of it, and I have been building it up ever since. It is not much yet, but it is mine." "What do you raise?" "Cattle mostly, some horses. I have about 200 head now, hoping to expand to 500 in the next few years if the market stays strong." Deborah listened as Matthew talked about his plans, surprised by how comfortable she felt. He did not pry into her past or make veiled comments about her reputation. He simply talked to her like a person, and that simple courtesy was more valuable than gold. The ranch appeared over a rise, a collection of buildings clustered around a central yard. The house was modest but well-maintained, with a wide porch and a chimney that spoke of warm fires in winter. The barn was larger, and Deborah could see cattle dotting the pastures beyond. 3 men emerged from the barn as the wagon pulled up, all of them sun-browned and lean. Matthew made introductions. "This is Mrs. Gardner, the seamstress I told you about. Mrs. Gardner, these are my men, Jack, Pete, and Samuel." The men nodded politely, removing their hats. They were younger than Matthew, probably in their early 20s, with the easy camaraderie of men who worked well together. "Pleased to meet you, madam," Jack said. He was the tallest, with sandy hair and a shy smile. "We surely need someone who can fix our clothes proper." "I will do my best," Deborah replied. Matthew led her inside the house, which was surprisingly tidy for a bachelor establishment. The main room held a large table, comfortable chairs, and a stone fireplace. "I thought you could take measurements here where there is good light." For the next hour, Deborah measured each of the men for new shirts, noting their dimensions in a small notebook. They were polite and respectful, treating her with an easy friendliness that made her chest ache. This was what normal felt like, she realized. This was how people should interact without the weight of judgment and suspicion. When she finished, Matthew offered her coffee and they sat at the big table while his men returned to their work outside. "They are good boys," Matthew said. "Loyal and hardworking. I am lucky to have them." "They seem fond of you as well. We have been through some hard times together. That builds trust." He paused. "Mrs. Gardner, I hope you do not mind me saying this, but you seem surprised by how you have been treated today." Deborah looked down at her cup. "The people in town have not been kind to me since my husband died. May I ask why?" She had known this question would come eventually. Deborah took a breath. "Thomas killed himself. The town believes I drove him to it. They say I was a terrible wife, that I spent his money and nagged him until he could not bear to live anymore." The words tasted bitter. "None of it is true, but the truth does not matter when people have already decided who you are." Matthew was quiet for a long moment. "What is the truth?" No one had asked her that. Not the sheriff, not the minister, not any of the women who had once called themselves her friends. They had all simply assumed. Deborah felt tears prick at her eyes but forced them back. "The truth is that Thomas gambled. He lost money we did not have, made debts he could not pay. When I tried to talk to him about it, he would rage at me. Near the end, he was drinking heavily. I was frightened of him sometimes." Her voice dropped to almost a whisper. "The morning he died, we had argued. He wanted money for a card game, and I told him we had none left. He called me terrible names and rode off. When they found him, there was a gun in his hand and our rent money in his pocket, the money I had hidden away to keep us from being thrown out on the street. And the town blamed you. A woman is always to blame when her husband falls short. That is simply how it is. Matthew's jaw tightened. That is not how it should be. Perhaps not, but it is how it is here. They sat in silence for a while, and Deborah waited for Matthew to make an excuse, to suddenly remember that he actually did not need a seamstress after all. Instead, he refilled her coffee cup. "My father drank," Matthew said finally. "Whiskey, mostly. When I was a boy, he would come home raging and take his disappointments out on my mother and me. She never blamed him, always made excuses, said it was her fault for not being a better wife, a better cook, a better something. I watched her shrink smaller and smaller until the day she died. I was 16. Deborah looked up at him, seeing the old pain in his eyes. I swore then that I would never touch liquor, and I would never blame others for my own failings. And I swore I would never stand by while someone was treated unjustly if I had the power to help. He met her gaze. "You have been treated unjustly, Mrs. Gardner. I cannot change what the town thinks, but I can offer you honest work and honest respect, if you will accept it." Something broke open in Deborah's chest, some dam that had been holding back more than just tears. She pressed a hand to her mouth, trying to maintain her composure, but a sob escaped anyway. Then another. Matthew reached across the table and placed his hand over her free one, his touch warm and solid. "It is all right," he said gently. "You are safe here." Deborah cried then, really cried for the first time since Thomas died. She cried for the loneliness and the shame, for the isolation and the fear. She cried for the girl she had been before her marriage soured, full of hope and dreams. And she cried in relief, because someone finally believed her, someone finally saw her as she truly was. When the tears finally subsided, she found herself holding Matthew's hand like a lifeline. She looked at their joined hands, then up at his face, and saw nothing but kindness there. "I apologize," she said, her voice rough. "I did not mean to burden you with this. You have not burdened me. Sometimes we all need to be heard, to be believed." Deborah withdrew her hand reluctantly and wiped at her face with her handkerchief. "Thank you for everything." "You are welcome here any time, Deborah. May I call you Deborah?" The sound of her given name, spoken with such warmth, made her heart stutter. "Yes, and may I call you Matthew? I would like that." The drive back to town felt different. Deborah was aware of Matthew beside her in a new way, conscious of his steady presence and the quiet strength he radiated. When he helped her down from the wagon at her gate, his hands lingered at her waist just a moment longer than necessary. "I will bring more mending next Friday," he said. "And the measurements for those shirts, if you could start working on them, of course. And Deborah, if you ever need anything at all, you can send word to the ranch. I will come." The sincerity in his voice made her throat tight again. "Thank you, Matthew." She watched him drive away, then turned to find Mrs. Henderson standing in the road, a basket over her arm. The older woman approached with a knowing smile. "Mr. Donnelly seems like a good man," she said carefully. "He is kind," Deborah replied, not sure where this was going. "Be careful, dear. The town already talks about you. If they think there is something improper happening, they will make your life even harder." "There is nothing improper. He hired me to do sewing." "I know that, and you know that, but people see what they want to see, Mrs. Henderson's expression softened. "I am not warning you away from him. Lord knows you deserve some happiness. Just be aware that kindness between a man and a woman is often misinterpreted, especially when the woman is a widow." "I appreciate the warning." Mrs. Henderson patted her arm. "He has a good reputation, Matthew Donnelly." Honest, hardworking, keeps to himself mostly. If anyone in this town deserves a fresh start with a good man, it is you." The word stayed with Deborah as she went inside. A fresh start. The idea seemed impossible and yet tantalizingly close. She looked at the coins Matthew had paid her, thought about his steady blue eyes and the way he had held her hand while she cried. She barely knew him, had met him only twice, but something in her recognized something in him. Two people who had survived hard things and come out the other side still capable of kindness. The weeks that followed fell into a comfortable rhythm. Matthew came every Friday with mending and stayed for coffee, sitting at her small kitchen table and talking about his ranch, his plans, his hopes. Deborah found herself looking forward to these visits with an anticipation that both thrilled and frightened her. She worked on the shirts for his men with extra care, embroidering small designs on the cuffs as a surprise. One Friday, in late May, Matthew arrived with a proposal. "There is a barn dance tomorrow night at the Henderson place. I was wondering if you would accompany me." Deborah's heart leaped and sank simultaneously. "Matthew, if I go to a dance with you, the talk will be vicious." "The talk is already happening. We might as well give them something real to talk about." He leaned forward, his expression earnest. "I enjoy your company, Deborah. I would like to spend more time with you, not just these brief Friday visits, but I will not push if you are not ready." Deborah thought about the long, lonely evenings in her house, about the cold shoulders and whispered insults. Then she thought about Matthew's smile, the way he listened when she talked, the respect he showed her. "I would like to go to the dance with you," she said. His face lit up. "Truly." "Truly. Though I fear I am out of practice. Thomas never liked dancing." "Then we will relearn together." The next evening, Deborah dressed in her best gown, a deep blue silk that she had not worn since before Thomas's death. She unpinned her hair from its severe bun and arranged it in soft waves around her face. When she looked in the mirror, she barely recognized herself. She looked younger, softer, more alive. Matthew's expression when he saw her was worth every risk. "You look beautiful," he said, his voice slightly awed. "Thank you. You look quite handsome yourself." He did, dressed in a clean white shirt and dark trousers, his hair neatly combed. He offered her his arm, and they walked together to the Henderson boarding house, where the barn out back had been cleared and decorated for the dance. The conversation died when they entered. Deborah felt every eye turn toward them, felt the weight of judgment and speculation. Her steps faltered, but Matthew's hand covered hers on his arm, steadying her. "Eyes on me," he murmured. "No one else matters." They moved into the room, and gradually the music started up again. Matthew led her onto the floor, and suddenly they were dancing, whirling to the fiddle music. Deborah had forgotten the joy of it, the pleasure of moving in time with another person, the dizzy happiness of being held and twirled. "You dance wonderfully," Matthew said, spinning her out and back in. "So do you. Where did you learn?" "My mother taught me before my father forbade it." He said dancing was frivolous. Matthew's grip tightened slightly. "I kept dancing anyway in secret. It was my small rebellion." They danced 3 dances in a row, and Deborah could feel the town watching. Some faces showed disapproval, but others looked curious, even approving. Mrs. Henderson was beaming from the refreshment table. When they finally took a break for punch, Jack, Pete, and Samuel appeared, asking politely if they could dance with her. Deborah agreed, touched by their courtesy. They were enthusiastic, if not entirely graceful dancers, and she found herself laughing at Pete's exaggerated twirls. "The boss is smitten with you," Samuel confided during their dance. "Never seen him so happy." "He is a good man," Deborah replied carefully. "The best. He deserves someone like you." When Matthew claimed her for another dance, Deborah felt lightheaded with happiness. This was what she had been missing, not just companionship, but joy. The simple pleasure of being treated like a person worthy of respect and affection. As the evening wore on, more people began to nod to them, acknowledging their presence. It was not universal acceptance, but it was a start. By the time Matthew walked her home under a sky full of stars, Deborah felt like she was floating. "Thank you for tonight," she said at her door. "I have not enjoyed myself so much in years." "Neither have I." Matthew reached out and gently tucked a loose strand of hair behind her ear. "Deborah, I need to be honest with you about my intentions." Her heart began to pound. "What intentions?" "I am courting you. I know it has only been a few weeks, but I find myself thinking about you constantly. You are intelligent and strong and kind, and when I am with you, I feel like the man I always wanted to be. If you do not share my feelings, please tell me now, and I will respect that. But if there is any chance you might, in time, come to care for me, I would like to continue seeing you properly." Deborah looked up at him, this good man who had appeared in her life like an answer to a prayer she had not known how to form. "I do care for you, Matthew. I have tried to keep this professional, but I failed. When you are near me, I feel safe, I feel seen. I have not felt that in so long. Then I can keep coming, keep taking you to dances and maybe Sunday dinners." "Yes, please, yes." Matthew's smile could have lit up the darkness. He raised her hand to his lips and kissed her knuckles gently. "Sleep well, Deborah." "You too, Matthew." She watched him walk away, her hand still tingling from his kiss. Inside, she leaned against the door and pressed her fingers to her lips, trying to contain the smile that threatened to split her face in two. This was what falling in love felt like, she realized. Not the desperate neediness she had felt with Thomas, but this warm certainty, this sense of rightness. The summer passed in a golden haze. Matthew courted her properly, with Sunday afternoon picnics and evening walks and long conversations on her porch. He brought her wildflowers from his ranch and helped her repair the sagging fence around her garden. His men became her friends, often stopping by with mending or just to chat when they came to town. The town's attitude began to shift, slowly but perceptibly. When people saw that Matthew Donnelly, a respected rancher, was courting the widow Gardner openly and honestly, they had to reconsider their assumptions. Maybe she was not the terrible woman they had believed her to be. Maybe there was more to the story than they knew. In late August, Matthew asked Deborah to come to the ranch for the day. "I want to show you something," he said mysteriously. She rode out with him on a Saturday morning, the heat already building despite the early hour. At the ranch, Matthew led her past the house and barn to a spot on a small rise overlooking the valley. There, the frame of a new building stood against the sky. "What is this?" Deborah asked. "A new house. The current one is fine for me and the men, but I want something better. Something with a real parlor and a big kitchen and bedrooms for a family." He turned to face her, taking both her hands. "Deborah, I am building this house for us, if you will have me." Deborah's breath caught. "Matthew, are you asking what I think you are asking? I love you, Deborah Gardner. I love your strength and your resilience and the way you laugh at Pete's terrible jokes. I love how you hum when you sew and how you always save the best pieces of cornbread for me. I want to spend my life with you, building this ranch and this future together. Will you marry me?" Tears streamed down Deborah's face, but these were tears of joy. "Yes, yes, Matthew, I will marry you." He swept her into his arms, lifting her off her feet and spinning her around. When he set her down, he kissed her for the first time, and Deborah felt like she was finally, truly home. His lips were soft but certain, and she melted into the kiss, letting herself feel the full force of her love for this man who had seen past her scarred reputation to the woman beneath. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, Matthew rested his forehead against hers. I will make you happy, I swear it. You already have." They set the wedding for October, after the fall roundup when Matthew would have time for a brief honeymoon. Deborah threw herself into preparations, sewing her own wedding dress from ivory silk that Matthew insisted on buying her. Mrs. Henderson helped with the planning, delighted to see Deborah so happy. Not everyone approved. There were still those in town who muttered that Deborah had trapped another man, that poor Matthew Donnelly did not know what he was getting into. But their voices grew quieter as the summer turned to fall and Matthew's devotion never wavered. One afternoon in September, Deborah was sewing in her parlor when someone knocked sharply on her door. She opened it to find a thin, hard-faced woman she recognized as Thomas's cousin, Martha Green. "Mrs. Green," Deborah said cautiously, "how can I help you? You can stop this charade of a wedding, that is what you can do." Martha's voice was sharp with venom. "Thomas has been dead barely 2 years and you are already marrying another man. Have you no shame?" Deborah felt her spine stiffen. "I have mourned my husband appropriately. My engagement to Mr. Donnelly is no one's business but our own. Thomas loved you, gave you everything, and this is how you repay his memory." "Thomas did not love me," Deborah said, her voice steady despite the anger rising in her chest. "He loved whiskey and cards. He loved the fantasy of winning big. He never loved me, not really, and I think you know that. You were at our house often enough toward the end. You saw how he treated me." Martha's face flushed. He was under strain. A man needs support from his wife, not judgment. I gave him support until there was nothing left of me to give, and when he made the choice to end his life, that was his choice, not mine. I will not carry his sins anymore, Mrs. Green. I am done with that burden. The town knows what you are. The town is welcome to its opinions. I know who I am, and more importantly, Matthew knows who I am. That is all that matters." Martha looked like she wanted to say more, but Deborah closed the door firmly in her face. Her hands were shaking with adrenaline and anger. For 2 years, she had accepted the town's judgment, had bowed her head and tried to make herself small and inoffensive. But she was done with that. She was going to marry Matthew Donnelly and build a life with him, and anyone who did not like it could look away. That evening, when Matthew came for dinner, she told him about Martha's visit. His jaw tightened with anger, but he simply pulled her close and held her. "Some people cannot stand to see others find happiness," he said. "It reminds them of their own misery. Pay her no mind. I am not. I am done letting other people's opinions rule my life. Good. You are stronger than all of them combined." The wedding took place on a bright October morning in the small church at the edge of Stein's Pass. Mrs. Henderson had decorated it with late blooming wildflowers, and Matthew's men served as groomsmen. There were fewer guests than there might have been for other weddings, but those who came were genuine in their well wishes. Deborah walked down the aisle alone, her head high. She wore the ivory silk dress she had made, with delicate lace at the collar and cuffs. Her hair was arranged in soft curls, and she carried a bouquet of desert marigolds. Matthew waited at the altar in his best suit, and when he saw her, his eyes filled with tears. She reached him and took his hand, and the minister began the ceremony. The words washed over her like a blessing. To have and to hold for better or worse in sickness and health as long as they both should live. "I do," Deborah said firmly. "I do," Matthew echoed. When the minister pronounced them husband and wife, Matthew kissed her tenderly and the small congregation applauded. They walked back down the aisle together, and Deborah felt 10 feet tall. She had survived the worst the world could throw at her, and she had come out the other side with this good man by her side. The reception was held at the ranch, which had been transformed by Sam, Jack, and Pete. They had hung lanterns and set up long tables laden with food. More people came to the celebration than had attended the church service, drawn by curiosity or genuine affection. Deborah did not care which. She danced with her new husband under the stars and felt nothing but joy. Late in the evening, when most of the guests had left, Matthew took her hand and led her to the new house. It was finished now, the walls painted and the floors polished. He had furnished it simply but comfortably, with a big bed in the main bedroom and curtains at all the windows. "Welcome home, Mrs. Donnelly," he said, sweeping her up into his arms and carrying her over the threshold. Deborah laughed, giddy with happiness. "It is beautiful, Matthew. You are beautiful. Everything else is just wood and nails." He set her down gently in the bedroom, and for a moment they simply looked at each other, the weight and promise of the night ahead hanging between them. Matthew reached up and carefully began removing the pins from her hair, letting the dark waves fall around her shoulders. "I love you," he said softly. "I will tell you that every day for the rest of our lives, and it still will not be enough. I love you too. You saved me, Matthew. You gave me a future when I thought I had none. We saved each other." He kissed her then, slow and deep, and Deborah gave herself over to the moment, to the feeling of being cherished and desired. The past fell away, and there was only the present, only Matthew's gentle hands and whispered words of love. She had been alone for so long, had forgotten what it meant to be truly intimate with another person, body and soul. With Matthew, everything was different. He was patient and tender, asking permission with every touch, making sure she was comfortable and willing. "Are you all right?" he asked, pausing to look at her with concern. "I am perfect," Deborah assured him. "Do not stop." The night unfurled in waves of pleasure and connection, and by the time they finally fell asleep in each other's arms, Deborah felt reborn. This was what marriage should be, she thought drowsily. This partnership, this equality, this love. The months that followed were the happiest of Deborah's life. She settled into her role as ranch wife with ease, managing the household and continuing her sewing work, now for pleasure rather than desperate need. She learned to ride, something Thomas had never permitted, and often accompanied Matthew when he checked on his herds. The men treated her like family, respectfully calling her Mrs. Donnelly but joking with her like a sister. Sam taught her to shoot, reasoning that a ranch wife should know how to handle a rifle. Jack brought her cuttings from his mother's garden to help her establish her own. Pete serenaded her with terrible off-key songs that made everyone laugh. In the spring of 1882, Deborah realized she was pregnant. She told Matthew on a Sunday evening as they sat on their porch watching the sunset. He was silent for a long moment, and she felt a flicker of fear. They had not discussed children, had been too caught up in their own happiness. "Matthew, are you all right?" He turned to her with wonder in his eyes. "We are having a baby. Yes. In November, I think." He let out a whoop of joy and pulled her into his arms, then immediately loosened his grip. "Am I holding you too tightly? Should you be resting? What do you need?" Deborah laughed at his sudden nervousness. "I need you to stop worrying. I am healthy and strong. Women have babies every day. But this is our baby, our family." "Yes, it is." Matthew placed a hand on her still flat stomach, his expression reverent. "I am going to be a father. I never thought. I never let myself hope for this." "Well, hope for it now. And maybe hope that the baby gets your temperament and my sewing skills, because otherwise this child is going to be very frustrated." He laughed and kissed her. "I love you so much, Deborah. I love you too." The pregnancy progressed smoothly. Deborah felt well, though she tired more easily as the months wore on. Matthew fussed over her constantly, insisting she rest and refusing to let her lift anything heavy. His men were just as bad, treating her like she was made of glass. "I am pregnant, not dying," Deborah protested after Pete practically tackled her to prevent her from picking up a basket of laundry. "Sorry, Mrs. Donnelly," Pete said sheepishly. "Boss said we were to make sure you did not overdo it." The boss needs to remember that women have been having babies since the dawn of time. But secretly, she was touched by their concern. This was what family felt like, she realized. People who cared about your well-being, who showed their love through actions both big and small. In November, as predicted, Deborah went into labor. Matthew paced the parlor while Mrs. Henderson and the doctor attended to her in the bedroom. The labor was long and difficult, and there were moments when Deborah feared she would not survive it. But she was strong and determined, and finally, as dawn broke over the ranch, she heard the lusty cry of her newborn son. "It is a boy," Mrs. Henderson announced, bringing the cleaned and wrapped baby to her. "Healthy and strong." Deborah took her son in her arms, marveling at his tiny, perfect features. He had Matthew's nose and a shock of dark hair. "Hello, little one," she whispered. "Welcome to the world." Matthew was allowed in then, and the look on his face when he saw his son made Deborah's heart overflow. He sat on the edge of the bed, carefully touching the baby's tiny hand. "He is perfect," Matthew said, his voice choked with emotion. "You are perfect. Thank you, Deborah. Thank you for this gift." "What should we name him?" Deborah asked. They had discussed names but never settled on one. Matthew thought for a moment. "What about James, after my grandfather? He was a good man, one of the few in my family who showed me kindness." "James Donnelly, I like it." "James Matthew Donnelly," Matthew said. "If that is acceptable to you, it is perfect." They spent the first few days in a haze of sleeplessness and wonder, learning to care for their son. James was a good baby, relatively calm and easy to soothe. Matthew proved to be a natural father, patient and gentle. He would walk the floor with James for hours, singing softly or telling him stories about the ranch. The men were smitten with the baby, taking turns holding him and making ridiculous faces to try to get him to smile. Sam carved him a set of wooden animals. Jack's mother sent a beautiful quilt. Pete composed a song about James that was so sentimental and off-key that it made everyone laugh until they cried. As Christmas approached, Deborah reflected on how much her life had changed in just over a year. She had gone from being a shunned widow living on the edge of survival to a beloved wife and mother with a home full of love. The town's opinion of her had shifted too. When she went into Stein's Pass now, people greeted her politely. Mrs. Miller at the general store actually smiled at her. Martha Green had moved away, and no one mentioned Thomas anymore. On Christmas Eve, the ranch house was full of warmth and light. Sam, Jack, and Pete joined them for dinner, along with Mrs. Henderson and a few other friends from town. They ate roasted chicken and potatoes, and the pies that Deborah had made despite Matthew's protests that she should be resting. After dinner, Matthew stood and raised his glass. "I want to make a toast to my wife, Deborah, who is the strongest and bravest woman I know. To my son, James, who has brought more joy into my life than I knew was possible. And to all of you, my friends, who have become our family. May we have many more years together just like this one." "Hear, hear," everyone chorused, clinking their glasses. Later, after the guests had left and James was asleep in his cradle, Deborah and Matthew sat together by the fire. She was tucked against his side, his arm around her shoulders, both of them too content to speak. Finally, Matthew broke the comfortable silence. "You ever think about the past? About how things were before we met?" "Sometimes," Deborah admitted, "but it feels like a different lifetime, like it happened to a different person." "I think about it too, how close we both came to missing this. If I had not needed a seamstress, if you had turned me away, if either of us had let fear stop us. But we did not. We took the risk. And I am so grateful we did." Matthew kissed the top of her head. You are my greatest blessing, Deborah, you and James. You are mine as well. You saw me when no one else would. You gave me a chance when I thought I had none. You offered me a future without judgment. You deserved nothing less. Everyone deserves to be seen for who they truly are, not for their worst moments or biggest mistakes. They sat in silence again, watching the flames dance. Deborah thought about the woman she had been 2 years ago, broken and hopeless. She thought about the strength it had taken to survive, to keep going even when every day felt impossible. And she thought about how love, real love, had the power to heal wounds she had not even known she carried. "Thank you," she said softly. "For what? For seeing me, for loving me, for giving me this life. Thank you for letting me, for trusting me, for building this life with me." The years flowed by like water. James grew from a baby into a toddler, then a sturdy little boy who followed his father everywhere and was spoiled shamelessly by the ranch hands. In 1884, Deborah gave birth to a daughter they named Rose, who had her mother's dark hair and her father's blue eyes. 2 years later came another son, Thomas, named not for Deborah's first husband but for Matthew's grandfather, whose full name had been Thomas James. The ranch prospered under Matthew's careful management. The herd grew to 500 head, then 1,000. They built a second barn and hired more men. Matthew bought the adjacent property when it came up for sale, doubling their land. Through it all, he remained the same steady, kind man Deborah had fallen in love with, never letting success change his character. Deborah's sewing business became a pleasant sideline rather than a necessity. She took commissions from wealthy ranchers' wives who wanted her fine handiwork on their gowns and their children's clothes. The money she earned, she saved carefully, wanting to contribute to the family finances even though Matthew insisted it was unnecessary. "I am not Thomas," he would say gently. "You do not have to prove your worth to me. You already do more than enough." "I know," Deborah would reply. "But I like to sew, and I like knowing I can still support myself if I need to. Old habits die hard." He understood. The scars from her first marriage had faded but would never completely disappear, and he never pushed her to ignore them. The children grew and thrived. James was serious and responsible, already talking about running the ranch someday. Rose was wild and free, happiest when she was riding her pony across the hills. Thomas was the baby, sweet-natured and gentle, content to sit with his mother while she sewed or follow his father's men around, asking endless questions. In 1888, when James was 6, Rose was 4, and Thomas was 2, the town of Steins Pass held a celebration for the completion of the new church building. Everyone was invited, and Deborah found herself helping to organize the festivities. It was strange, she reflected, to be welcomed so fully into the community that had once shunned her. But people's memories were short, and her reputation as Matthew Donnelly's capable wife had long since eclipsed any lingering whispers about her past. At the celebration, an older woman Deborah did not recognize approached her. "Mrs. Donnelly, forgive me, I am Gardner. I was Thomas Gardner's aunt." Deborah tensed. She had not heard that name spoken aloud in years. "Mrs. Gardner, how can I help you?" I wanted to apologize. "I was not here when Thomas died. I was back east caring for my own dying husband. But I heard how you were treated, and I have always felt ashamed of my family's behavior. My nephew was not an easy man. His father, my brother, had similar demons. I am glad to see you have found happiness." Deborah was taken aback by the frank honesty. "Thank you, that means more than you know. Your children are beautiful. You and your husband have built a good life." "We have. It was not easy, but it was worth it." Eleanor smiled. "The best things rarely are. Take care, my dear." She walked away, leaving Deborah with a sense of closure she had not known she needed. The past was truly past now. She was no longer Deborah Gardner, the shunned widow. She was Deborah Donnelly, wife, mother, respected member of the community. The transformation was complete. That night, after the children were asleep, she told Matthew about the encounter. He held her close and said, "You have always been worthy of respect and kindness. I am just glad the world finally caught up to what I knew all along." The years continued to pass, marked by the changing seasons and the milestones of their children's lives. James learned to rope and brand cattle, taking on more responsibility as he grew. Rose learned to shoot as well as any man and announced her intention to never marry, to everyone's amusement. Thomas remained the gentle soul, more interested in books and drawing than ranch work, and Matthew supported him fully. "Not every boy wants to be a rancher," he said when Sam expressed surprise at Thomas's artistic leanings. "My son will be whatever makes him happy." In 1892, Sam announced he was getting married to a schoolteacher from a nearby town. Matthew and Deborah hosted the wedding at the ranch, and it was a joyous affair. Pete got drunk and sang even more terribly than usual. Jack caught the garter and blushed furiously. James, now 10, acted as ring-bearer with great seriousness. Rose, 8, decided weddings were boring but perked up when the dancing started. Thomas, 6, fell asleep under a table and had to be carried to bed. Watching Sam dance with his new bride, Deborah felt a pang of bittersweetness. The men who had been her first friends at the ranch were growing up, moving on. But that was how life worked. People grew and changed, and you had to celebrate the joy even as you acknowledged the passage of time. "Feeling sentimental?" Matthew asked, sliding an arm around her waist. "A little." "They are all getting so old." "We are getting old," he corrected with a smile. "I found a gray hair yesterday. Only one, I have dozens. And you are more beautiful than ever." Deborah leaned into him, grateful as always for his steady presence. They had been married 10 years now, and she loved him more deeply than she had thought possible. Not the wild, desperate love of youth, but something richer and more enduring. A love built on trust and respect and 10,000 small kindnesses. The next decade brought more changes. Pete moved to California to try his luck in the gold fields, though he wrote regularly. Jack married a widow with 3 children and settled on a small ranch nearby. Sam and his wife had 4 children in rapid succession, and the ranch was often full of their laughter. Matthew hired new men to replace those who moved on, and Deborah welcomed them into the fold with the same warmth she had shown the first 3. James grew into a young man of 20, tall and capable, every inch his father's son. He started courting a girl from town, a quiet, pretty thing named Annie who reminded Deborah of herself at that age. Rose, at 18, shocked the family by falling in love with a traveling photographer and announcing her intention to see the world before she settled down. Matthew gave his blessing, though Deborah could see it cost him to let his wild daughter go. Thomas, 16, was accepted to a school in Santa Fe to study art. He was the first member of the family to pursue higher education, and both parents were immensely proud. The night before he left, Matthew gave him a long hug and whispered something in his ear that made Thomas nod solemnly. Later, Deborah asked what he had said. Matthew smiled. "I told him that it does not matter what he does in life, as long as he does it with integrity and kindness. That is the only legacy I care about. You are a good father. I learned from the best mother." As 1900 dawned, marking the turn of the century, Matthew and Deborah found themselves essentially empty nesters. James had married Annie and built a house on the edge of the ranch property. Rose was in New York, her letters full of excitement about the bustling city. Thomas was thriving in Santa Fe, his paintings starting to sell. The big ranch house felt quiet without the chaos of children. "We should get a dog," Matthew suggested one morning over breakfast. Deborah laughed. "A dog. Or 2. Or 10. Something to make noise and keep us young." They settled on 2 puppies, which proceeded to chew everything in sight and bring mud into the house and generally cause delightful havoc. Deborah found herself laughing more than she had in years, chasing the dogs out of the kitchen and scolding them for stealing Matthew's socks. Life had a way of evening out, she reflected. The hard years made you appreciate the good ones. The loneliness made you treasure the love. She looked at Matthew across the breakfast table one morning, his hair now more gray than dark, his face lined with years of sun and wind, and thought he had never looked more handsome. "What are you thinking?" he asked, catching her staring. "That I am the luckiest woman alive." "I am the lucky one. We both are." In 1902, James and Annie gave them their first grandchild, a boy they named Matthew after his grandfather. Deborah held the baby and felt the circle of life completing itself. She was 45 now, old enough to be a grandmother, and yet she felt younger than she had at 25, when despair had aged her beyond her years. Rose came home for the birth, full of stories about her travels. She had been to 15 states and was planning a trip to Europe. "But I always come home eventually," she assured her parents. "This is where my heart is." Thomas sent a painting of the ranch from memory, and it was so beautiful and accurate that Deborah cried when she saw it. He had captured not just the buildings and the land, but the feeling of the place, the sense of home and love that permeated every corner. More grandchildren followed. James and Annie had 3 children in total. Rose eventually settled down with a kind man she met in Boston, a doctor who supported her adventurous spirit. They had 2 children and split their time between Boston and the ranch. Thomas married a woman he met in Santa Fe, a fellow artist, and they had 1 daughter who was every bit as creative as her parents. The ranch continued to thrive under James's management, with Matthew gradually handing over more responsibility to his son. He and Deborah spent their days in comfortable partnership, riding out to check on the herds, tending the garden, sitting on the porch and watching the sunset. One evening in 1905, as they sat in their usual spot, Matthew took Deborah's hand. "Do you remember when I first came to your door? 24 years ago, of course. You needed mending. I needed you. I just did not know it yet." Deborah squeezed his hand. "I needed you too. I was drowning and you threw me a lifeline." "We saved each other," Matthew said, echoing the words he had spoken on their wedding night. "And we built this beautiful life, these beautiful children, this beautiful legacy." "Are you getting sentimental in your old age?" Deborah teased. "Maybe. Or maybe I am just aware of how precious all of this is, how easily it could have been different. But it was not different. We found each other, and we chose each other, and we built this life together. That is all that matters." They sat in companionable silence as the sun sank below the horizon, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink and purple. The ranch spread out before them, a testament to their hard work and love. In the distance, they could see James's house, smoke rising from the chimney. Tomorrow, Rose and her family would arrive for a visit. Next week, Thomas was coming with his wife and daughter. The house that had once felt so empty was about to be full again, full of laughter and love and the chaos of family. Deborah could hardly wait. This was what it had all been for, she realized. The struggle and the pain, the loneliness and the fear. It had all led her to this moment, to this man, to this life. "I love you," she said softly. "I love you too. Always have, always will." The stars began to appear in the darkening sky, and somewhere in the distance, a coyote howled. The dogs barked in response, and Matthew laughed. Deborah leaned her head on his shoulder and closed her eyes, feeling utterly content. She had been shunned for mistakes that were not hers, had been judged by a town that did not know her story. But Matthew had seen past all of that to the woman she truly was. He had offered her a future without judgment, and together they had built something beautiful. Their love story was not perfect or easy, but it was real and enduring, and in the end, that was all anyone could ask for. A chance to be seen, to be loved, to build a life worth living. Deborah Donnelly had been given that chance, and she had seized it with both hands. The past was behind her, forgiven if not forgotten. The future stretched ahead, bright with promise. She had come so far from that desperate widow waiting for scraps of kindness. She had become someone stronger, someone whole. And she had done it not alone, but with a partner who saw her worth and reflected it back to her every single day. As she sat there in the gathering darkness, Matthew's hand warm in hers, Deborah felt a deep and abiding gratitude. For second chances and new beginnings, for love that healed old wounds, for the wild, beautiful land that had given her a home, for the man beside her who had seen past her mistakes to the person she could become. Their story had begun with judgment and shame, but it had transformed into something luminous. A testament to the power of kindness, the resilience of the human heart, and the simple truth that everyone deserves to be seen for who they truly are. Not for their worst moments, but for their strength in surviving them. Not for their past mistakes, but for their courage in building a better future. Matthew had given her that gift, and she had given it back to him. Together, they had created a legacy that would outlast them both. Children and grandchildren who would carry forward the lessons they had learned. That love matters, that kindness matters, that everyone deserves a second chance. The night deepened, and they eventually went inside, the dogs following at their heels. Tomorrow would bring new challenges and new joys, as every day did. But Deborah was no longer afraid. She had learned that she was strong enough to face whatever came, and she would never face it alone. She had been given a future without judgment, and in return, she had given Matthew a love without reservation. It was a fair trade, the best she had ever made. And as she drifted off to sleep that night, safe in her husband's arms, Deborah knew that she would make the same choice again in a heartbeat. Every day for the rest of her life, she would choose this love, this man, this beautiful, hard-won future they had built together. The years rolled on, each one bringing its own mixture of joy and sorrow, triumph and challenge. In 1910, Matthew celebrated his 60th birthday surrounded by his children, grandchildren, and the ranch hands who had become like family. Deborah, 53 now, organized the entire affair with her usual efficiency, baking his favorite cake and making sure everyone who mattered was there. "You did not have to do all this," Matthew protested, though his smile showed how touched he was. "Yes, I did. You deserve to be celebrated." And he did. This man who had taken a chance on a shunned widow, who had built a ranch from nearly nothing, who had raised 3 wonderful children and helped raise 8 grandchildren. He deserved every bit of joy the world could offer. The celebration lasted well into the night, with stories and songs and more food than anyone could eat. James gave a speech about what his father had taught him about integrity and hard work. Rose read a poem she had written about growing up on the ranch. Thomas presented a portrait he had painted of his parents, capturing them as they were now, older but no less beautiful, their love evident in every brushstroke. When everyone had finally gone home or to bed, Matthew and Deborah sat on their porch once more, a ritual that had sustained them through 28 years of marriage. "Thank you for today," Matthew said. "For all the days, really. You have given me a life I never dreamed possible." "We gave it to each other," Deborah corrected, Neither of us could have done it alone. No, but together we were unstoppable. They sat in comfortable silence, and Deborah thought about how far they had come. The widow and the cowboy, two broken people who had found each other and built something whole. It sounded like a fairy tale, but it was real. As real as the calluses on her hands from sewing and gardening. As real as the silver in Matthew's hair. As real as the grandchildren sleeping in the house, safe and loved. This was her happily ever after, and it was better than any she could have imagined. Not because it was perfect, but because it was earned. Every moment of joy had been paid for with moments of struggle. Every laugh had been earned through tears, but that made it all the more precious. "What are you thinking about?" Matthew asked. "Everything. Nothing. How grateful I am." "Me too." In the distance, an owl hooted and the dogs stirred sleepily at their feet. The ranch was quiet now, peaceful. Deborah could feel the weight of years settling on her shoulders, but it was a comfortable weight. The weight of a life well lived, of love freely given and received. "You have any regrets?" she asked Matthew. He considered the question seriously. "None that matter. I wish I had found you sooner, that we could have had more years together. But I am grateful for the years we have had." "No regrets," Deborah agreed. "Not a single one that matters, because that was the truth." Yes, she had suffered through her first marriage. Yes, she had endured judgment and isolation. But all of it had led her here, to this porch, to this man, to this life. And she would not trade a moment of it. The moon rose, full and bright, casting silver light over the ranch. Somewhere, one of the grandchildren laughed in their sleep. Matthew pulled Deborah closer, and she rested her head on his shoulder, feeling the steady beat of his heart. This was what she had been searching for all along, she realized. Not rescue, but partnership. Not someone to save her, but someone to stand beside her. Matthew had offered her a future without judgment, but more than that, he had offered her respect, trust, and unwavering love. And she had given him the same in return. Their love story was not dramatic or flashy. It was quiet and steady, built on a foundation of mutual respect and genuine affection. It was coffee shared on cold mornings and hands held during long walks. It was supporting each other's dreams and weathering each other's storms. It was choosing each other, over and over, day after day, year after year. And it was enough. More than enough. It was everything. As the night deepened and the stars wheeled overhead, Matthew and Deborah Donnelly sat together on their porch, two souls who had found their home in each other. The past was forgiven. The present was cherished. The future was secure, built on love that would outlast them both. They had started as strangers, a desperate widow and a kind cowboy. They had become partners, lovers, friends. They had built a family, a legacy, a life worth living. And through it all, they had never stopped choosing each other. That was the real fairy tale, Deborah thought as sleep began to claim her. Not the dramatic rescue or the grand gesture, but the daily choice to love and be loved. The commitment to see each other clearly and cherish what you saw. The courage to build a future together, one day at a time. Matthew carried her to bed that night, as he often did when she fell asleep on the porch. She murmured a protest, but settled into his arms, trusting him completely. He laid her gently on their bed and climbed in beside her, pulling the quilt over them both. "Good night, my love," he whispered. "Good night," she replied, already half asleep. They would wake in the morning to new challenges and new joys. The ranch would need tending. The grandchildren would need attention. Life would continue in its beautiful, complicated way, but they would face it together as they always had. Two people who had been given a second chance and made the most of it. Two hearts that had found their home in each other. The widow had been shunned for her past mistakes. The cowboy had offered her a future without judgment. Together, they had built a love story for the ages, one that would be remembered long after they were gone. Not because it was dramatic or tragic, but because it was real and true and enduring. And in the end, that was the only kind of love story worth telling. The kind where two imperfect people chose each other and built something beautiful. The kind where love conquered not through grand gestures but through daily kindness. The kind where the happy ending was not the destination but the journey itself. Deborah and Matthew Donnelly had walked that journey together, hand in hand, heart to heart. And they would continue walking it for all the years they had left, grateful for every single moment. Their story was complete, their love secure, their legacy assured. They had built a life without judgment and with infinite love, and that made all the difference.